Hello, and welcome to the Book Speaks podcast, where the book speaks for itself. I'm your host, Benjamin Douglas, and this is the show where each week I read a chapter from a different indie author. Thanks for joining me for today's reading. Hello, readers and writers alike. Welcome to episode number 38 of the Book Speaks podcast, where the book speaks for itself. As always, I'm your host, Benjamin Douglas, feeling very perky and awake this morning. This fine Saturday morning here at the beginning of December of 2017. And maybe part of that is because it's December. You know, December is one of my favorite months. I think I've mentioned before that I'm at the end of my doctoral degree in music right now. So I've been a student for a long time. I've actually finished coursework now, but I'm so institutionalized that now I'm teaching at a couple of colleges where I live. So I'm used to December being this wild month, this really manic time where during the first couple of weeks, everything is just crazy. And everybody's not getting any sleep and staying up all night doing projects and preparing recitals and big papers and research. And then all of a sudden, halfway through the month, it just all ends. And there's this big release. And in my younger days, I could lay on the couch and eat cookies and watch Netflix. And now that I'm a young father, I'll run around the couch in circles chasing my toddler. So either way, pretty cool. I love December. I hope NaNoWriMo went well for you. I've been seeing a lot of success stories and a lot of people coming out and saying, you know, I didn't get my 50,000 words, but I'm celebrating anyway because I wrote 20 or 30,000 words that I wouldn't have written otherwise. And I say to you, good on you, mate. Like, good for you to celebrate small successes. I personally want to thank everyone listening. I had a great success in November. I had my highest grossing indie author month yet in terms of income. I actually quadrupled my previous income due to some promo pushing and some mailing list shares and a new release. So very exciting for me. I'm not rolling in it yet. I can't quite cover my student loan payment yet, but I'm enjoying the ride. So thanks again if you're listening and if you've supported me at all. Today I'm going to be reading from indie author Samantha Lee. And this is not the only Samantha Lee on Amazon, so I want to point that out. This is a Samantha Lee specifically publishing books that are under the fantasy and the romance fantasy and the science fiction romance category. So without any further ado, I'm going to begin, as I always do, by reading Samantha's Amazon author bio. This is for Samantha Lee. Samantha Lee is the author of The Rise of the King, a book that reached the top 100 on Amazon. She lives in Phoenix, Arizona, and is often found reading or listening to a book. She writes to entertain both herself and her readers. When she is not writing, she is spending time with her twins, who keep her thoroughly entertained. Make sure to visit me at www.authorsamanthalee.com. Samantha Lee. All right, so there is her Amazon author bio. And as always, I'm going to be linking to Samantha's website, as well as her Amazon author page in the show notes at http://thebookspeakspodcast.wordpress.com. Woo, Samantha, twins. I don't know how you do that. I can barely handle one. But kudos to you. Today I'm actually going to be reading from book 2 in her King series. The first book that she mentioned there is Rise of the King. But today I'll be reading from The Great King. That's King series book 2. And now what I'd like to do is read the book description, that is the book blurb, for The Great King. Vampire King Dimitri Cross is fighting for his kingdom and the woman he loves, using his own rules. After Dmitri seized the throne, he thought things would go his way. But Dmitri is forced to enter an agreement that cost him his true love, Phoenix Gray. Tormented by the loss of his love, Dmitri turns his attention to removing his enemy Nidug, the Unsili king, from the kingdom. In the process, Dmitri finds an unexpected ally in the quirky but beautiful Seelie Queen. Teaming up with the Seelie Queen Priscilla and her Fey warriors, Dmitri takes on the Unsili king. Can Dmitri win the fight for his kingdom and the woman he loves before it is too late? The Great King is Book 2 in the King series, but can be read as a standalone or out of series order. All right, there's the book description. And this was just released here at the end of November 25th, 2017. So it's a new release. Great. I'm not going to talk much because the reading is fairly long. Samantha asked that I read chapter 7 from this second book in the King series. And so I did. And I can see why. There's some interesting character work. There's a big plot thing that happens to one of the primary characters. Well, a couple of the primary characters. So I hope you enjoy that today. But what I'd really like to talk about very briefly is the fantasy genre, because although I don't really have a stick up about it, I'm pretty easygoing, I do kind of align with those readers who tend to look at a book like this and say, hey, what are these vampires doing in my fantasy genre? I think it's very interesting, and I want to point out a trend in vampire literature. Really, vampires have really made their way into fantasy, or into at least what some readers are expecting to be called fantasy. So if you follow vampires at all, you of course know that vampires precede Dracula, but that Bram Stoker's novel, Dracula, from the 19th century, was kind of a big deal and a big turning point for vampires, and really kind of a seed and a foundation for what I would say is the modern or contemporary idea of a vampire in literature. And Dracula is kind of a horror novel, but it's also a romance. And I think this is important to recognize, because there is this idea out there that the romanticizing of vampires is kind of a recent thing, post Anne Rice, and especially with Twilight. And that before that, vampires were always just scary things that went bump in the night, a la Nosferatu and other like silent films. But that's a little disingenuous to Bram Stoker's Dracula, who was really a tragic, romantic figure. Yes, he was horrifying. Yes, it's like a gothic horror novel. And yet, at the same time, one of his like chief goals becomes seducing Mina Harker, because she so reminds him of his long-lost love that he's convinced she's like his ex-wife, his dead wife, reincarnated, which is quite tragic and very lovely in a way. And there's a heavy element, I would argue, of eroticism in Dracula for a 19th century work. You know, I mean, there's nothing explicit the way that erotica is now, but it's there. Like, there is some like heavy romantic and erotic theme going on. So there we have Dracula's both in horror and in sort of romance. And then, of course, Anne Rice comes along in the second half of the 20th century and blows us all out of the water with Interview with a Vampire, right? And then all these other books that have followed, and a couple of the film adaptations. And now we're like, ooh, vampires, so romantic. It's like we all remember. And then we have, of course, Twilight, and vampires now are like sparkly, kind of forever teenager sex icons, apparently, in a weird way. So just sort of, yes, it's traveled from Dracula, but I would argue it's still all kind of related to that. So here's a common thread I want to point out in vampire literature: romance. Okay, now let's talk fantasy, because if you're a reader like me, then fantasy is synonymous with what a lot of other people would probably call strictly epic fantasy or high fantasy. For me, the modern or contemporary genre of fantasy is founded on the works of Tolkien. Of course, there's fantasy before that, but what Tolkien really did was bring together some of the sort of folktaleisms of England, like fairies and stuff, and merge it with Finnish and Nordic mythologies. And he created this whole secondary universe, right? From which we know Middle Earth. And if you're a Tolkien nut like I am, then you're well aware that Lord of the Rings is just a sliver of that history in just a tiny spot on that universe. I mean, the really good stuff is the Silmarillion and the Unfinished Tales and the Books of Lost Tales. Oh my gosh, I love this stuff. And there aren't vampires, really. There are things called, I guess Sauron shifts into a wolf at one point, so he's kind of a werewolf, except he was never a were, he was never really a man, he was just a humanoid creature. So it's a little different than like the Hollywood monsters romanticized. It's really more about like elves and orcs and balrogs and hobbits and dwarves and these godlike deity things called the Valar and these sub-deities called the Maiar and the wizards who are like Maiar in disguise. Spoiler! And all this other cool stuff, and it heavily rests, on world building. Even though there are romances there, like Beren and Luthien, it really is about sort of the epic nature of, epic not folktales, but epic mythologies, epic poems, epic stories, right? Like Beowulf and stuff. This is kind of where, in my mind, fantasy comes from. So how do you reconcile these two ideas of romantic vampires and Tolkien-inspired fantasy? I'm not here to tell you. I'm here to pose the question. How is it that these two things are under the umbrella of fantasy? I'm not sure, but they are. Here's my suggestion. It's all about magic. Because you've got magic, obviously, happening with like the otherness of the elves who have some kind of craft that the humans don't know about in Middle Earth, right? And you've got magic in the sense that the Maiar are wizards in disguise. Wizards are Maiar in disguise, and they have some kind of craft brought with them from Valinor. Pardon me. Sorry, Tolkienites. I'm just speaking I'm riffing here. And yet. So there's magic, and in a lot of contemporary fantasy, there's just like straight up magic, like witches and wizards and stuff, right? Well, in this vampire stuff, a lot of times, there's also magic like witches or fae, right? Fairies. And in this particular series, the King series, there are witches, there are warlocks, there are fae, there are vampires, which of course in and of itself is a supernatural power. Why don't we just call it paranormal and not call it fantasy? I'm not entirely sure. But it's not just urban fantasy. In the King series, for example, there's definitely a secondary world that all of this is happening in. So anyway, I bring all this up without any answers, but just posing some interesting questions that I've been ruminating on. I hope you enjoyed today's reading. This is from Samantha Lee's The Great King, Book 2 of the King series. It's going to be Chapter 7, as I mentioned. As always, I want to remind everyone this reading is performed with the author's consent and permission. It does not come from an official audiobook, and I'll link to her information on the show notes. This is under fantasy romance, and so if you enjoy it, I encourage you to go check out that genre if you've not been familiarized with it. And if you've been interested at all in my discussion on vampires, or if you like vampires and you have read neither Dracula nor Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles, I highly suggest you start with both of those, which I think are both just excellent works of literature. All right, I leave you with that today. Thanks for listening, everyone. Enjoy the reading, and I'll see you next week. The Great King. King Series, Book 2, by Samantha Lee. Chapter 7. Phoenix took refuge in a dense group of trees, exhausted and trying to catch her breath. Bent over at the waist, she panted, gulping air greedily. Phoenix took off her helmet and shook out her sweat-soaked hair. Drops fell steadily from the strands onto the dirt. What in the fuck was going on? She thought in a panic. That was the 7th ambush in the last several hours. Either somebody was trying to keep them out of the Second Dominion, or worse, someone was trying to kill her, or Raphael, or both. As soon as she and Raphael finished off one ambush, a new wave of attackers followed, forcing them to fight for 8 hours straight. Phoenix was spent. There was no strength left in her body, and her limbs trembled uncontrollably. If another ambush came, she wouldn't survive. The last one had nearly finished her. Raphael stood 100 feet to the left, huddled in his own thicket of trees. His leather vest was ripped through, and blood spilled from his shoulder. Either he'd been hit by the last lichens, or the warlock had cut him with his sword. There had been so many attackers in the past hours that they all blended in Phoenix's mind. Phoenix straightened, trying to appear strong, but her legs threatened to buckle, and she willed herself to stay upright. Raphael breathed heavily, but he stood tall, his eyes sweeping left and right across the forest, looking for the next attacker. Phoenix would be worried about him, but he looked better than she did. Alert, his sword at the ready. Something had to give soon, or they'd both die tonight. And they'd never know why. Suddenly, Raphael ran toward her and grabbed her hand and ran, dragging her deeper in the forest. Phoenix stumbled and nearly fell, but Raphael yanked her arm hard, and she righted herself. Raphael pulled her along until they reached another dense thicket of trees. Phoenix's lungs burned, and she bent over again, gulping air. "Raphael, I can't go on. I need blood," she said. Raphael didn't answer, but scanned ahead, and when he determined it was safe, he ran again, pulling her behind him. Phoenix followed, tripping over roots and rocks. 2 ambushes ago, they'd lost everything in the fights, including their supplies, their food, and finally, the horses. At least they were still alive, but Phoenix had to wonder for how much longer. Vampires weren't the only creatures attacking. Every creature in the Dominions had come out. They were all hell-bent on destroying them. The ambush parties had included lichens, warlocks, and witches, oftentimes fighting together as a team. Even the occasional pathetically weak human armed with a sword had come to try his hand at killing them. Phoenix knew that at this point she couldn't defend herself against a human, much less a werewolf. An image of herself, neck exposed and slashed with a sword, flashed through her mind, and she shuddered. Raphael continued pulling her behind him, and Phoenix was certain that soon she would collapse, and Raphael would be forced to drag her. A long howl broke through the night, and Phoenix groaned. Not again, she thought. At the sound of the howl, Raphael came to an abrupt stop, and Phoenix collapsed to her knees. Raphael turned his head and sniffed the air, trying to locate where the next threat lay. He grabbed Phoenix by the arms to pull her up, but her arms slid in his grip. Phoenix stared at her arms as though they belonged to someone else. Slick blood covered them, and she didn't know if it was her blood or the blood of those she'd fought and killed. Even worse, she didn't care. Nothing made sense, and she wanted to lie down in the soft pine needles and close her eyes. Raphael looked down at Phoenix, his expression stern and decisive. "We have to split up," he said. "You stand a better chance if we divide and confuse them." Phoenix shook her head. "I am too weak to fight alone, Raphael. I can barely stand. There is no way I will survive another attack." Phoenix looked around the forest. "I don't even know where we are anymore. If we split up, how will I ever find you again?" Her voice sounded mournful and scared, like a small child. Phoenix, never one to give in to fear, felt close to tears. "We should stay together, Raphael." Raphael took off his shirt and handed it to Phoenix. "Take off your shirt and put on mine," he said, turning his back to give her privacy. Phoenix stood up, knees wobbling, and slipped her shirt over her head. "Why am I putting on your shirt?" she asked. Whatever his plan, she didn't think she would be able to hold up her part of it. "If we mix up our scents, they will follow me, believing I am you. From the way they attacked, I am sure they are after you. I am only incidental, because I am with you." Phoenix put Raphael's shirt on. "Raphael, I don't think you get it. I am too weak, and I can't fight anymore," Phoenix said. She looked at Raphael's back and noticed how his shoulders were slumped in exhaustion. "And what about you? You don't look much better than me." "I will be fine," he said. "I am older and stronger than you. Don't worry about anything but surviving. Find a place to hide and stay put. When it is over, I will find you." Phoenix finished buttoning Raphael's shirt and handed him her shirt. Raphael pulled it over his head. Grabbing her chin in his hand, he looked at her intently, his eyes full of unspoken affection. "Stay safe, Phoenix. Whatever you do, stay safe." Before she could answer, Raphael ran off into the forest so quickly that Phoenix lost sight of him within seconds. Then Phoenix did the same, running in the opposite direction. Her legs trembled, threatening to give out, but she ran as far and fast as she could. Phoenix didn't know how she ran, but she ran anyway, ran until her legs finally gave out, until she collapsed into the sweet, soft pine needles she so longed for. Phoenix breathed in the fresh, heady scent of the pine needles and didn't care if she lived or died. She wanted to stop, to rest, wanted to sleep. Even if someone found her, she wouldn't have the strength to fight. Phoenix felt the world go dark. She had always believed she would die fighting, but perhaps she was destined to die in a blissful and painful darkness. Phoenix let the darkness take her under, and breathed what she was certain would be her last conscious breath. And on the wind she breathed out the name of the man she loved. Dmitri. Nick felt a sharp, tingling sensation as though being swarmed by a cloud of bees. He grabbed his brother's arm and pulled him to a stop. There was something dark, something close to death nearby. "Frost, we should turn back," Nick said. "We haven't charted the area and don't know what is ahead. I can feel something dangerous." Frost yanked his arm back impatiently and continued walking. "Nick, use your powers to see if there's any game to hunt," he said. "Don't worry about anything else. I'll protect us both." Frost and Nick advanced only a few yards when Frost stopped suddenly and put his hand up to signal his brother to be silent. Frost sniffed the air and used his power to raise a gentle breeze at their feet. A silent dust devil of dust, of pine needles and leaves rose and shuffled the ground to cover their tracks. Frost motioned Nick to move behind a tree. "Stay put," he whispered. "Something isn't right." Nick nodded. "That's what I was trying to tell you," Nick whispered back. "The emotions in the air feel wrong. Something or someone is here." Frost put his hand on Nick's shoulder. "Stay here," he said. "I'll be right back." Frost elevated so that he cleared the ground by a few inches and floated silently through the trees, sniffing at the air to guide him. As he approached a clearing, Frost saw a woman on the ground. Her form curled against the trunk of a tree. The late afternoon sunlight spilled gold light, illuminating her as if she were an angel. The woman wasn't moving and breathed shallowly. Frost determined she was unconscious, but very much alive. Frost started to move toward the woman when a half-transformed lichen and a witch approached her from the opposite direction. The lichen bent low and looked in the woman's face, and with one swift move slashed his claws across the woman's neck. The woman's eyes opened, and she glared at the lichen. Her body arced up, and blood gushed from her neck and spilled out of her mouth. Then her body went limp again. The lichen and the witch exchanged a satisfied look. The witch smiled and grabbed the lichen's hand, and they vanished, fading into the surrounding air. Frost wondered if that had been a killing blow. From the amount of blood spilling from her, he suspected it was. Frost watched and waited a full minute to see if the lichen and the witch would return. When he was sure they wouldn't come back, he approached the woman and knelt down to examine her. The wound in her neck was deep, her head nearly severed. That had been the intention. The lichen hadn't stayed long enough to see that he finished his work. Frost used telekinesis to wrap pressure around her throat to hold her head steady. He lifted her in his arms and moved with his lightest step and fastest speed, his body a blur against the trees, and ran back to get Nick. Nick felt his brother approaching, and turned to see Frost holding a bleeding woman in his arms. Nick moved in close, and gasped at the wound in her neck, and reached to touch her. Frost didn't have time to deal with Nick's empathic feelings. "Hurry," Frost said. "Follow me home. She is still alive, but barely. We have to see if we can help her." Dmitri was meeting with Ambrose and Celeste in the study to discuss how to reorganize the dominions when the pain hit him. Ambrose spun a goblet of blood in his hands, admiring the ruby gleam in the lamplight. "You know, Dmitri, there will be great fallout." Dmitri suddenly doubled over and let out a low and pain-filled groan. The pain was so intense, he felt as though he were dying. Ambrose jumped up and put his hand on Dmitri's shoulder. "Dmitri, are you okay?" The pain left as quickly as it had come. Dmitri didn't know where the pain came from. He straightened and ran his hands through his hair. "I'm fine," he said. Dmitri had never felt pain like that. Dying would be preferable than feeling that pain a second longer. Dmitri took in a deep breath to steady himself, and scanned his body to see if he had been hurt somehow. That wasn't his pain, he realized. Dmitri cast out his mind and reached out across space, searching, and followed it as it ran through the city and into the forest, curving through the trees. When he found the source, he leapt up, knocking over the table. "Find Phoenix and Raphael right the fuck now!" he shouted, his face pale with fear. Ambrose reached out his hand to calm Dmitri. "What is wrong? What is going on, Dmitri?" "Something is wrong with Phoenix! Get someone to find them now!" Dmitri was frantic and ran to his rooms, tossing gear into a bag. Determined to find Phoenix himself, he slung the bag over his shoulders and was walking out the door when Ambrose rushed through the door. "We found Raphael," Ambrose said. "Or rather, he found us, and he is in bad shape. We took him straight to the infirmary." Dmitri dropped the bag and ran to the infirmary, his heart bursting in his chest. He flung open the infirmary door, tearing it off the hinges with his strength. Dmitri was in a berserker rage and a panic like he had never known. With eerie precision, he zoomed in on Raphael, who was struggling to sit up. "Where is she?" he demanded. Raphael was in a panic himself. "We had to split up because someone was chasing us." Raphael sat on the edge of the bed and tried to stand, but his legs wobbled and he flopped back down. "I have to find her. I promised her I would." "Who was chasing you?" Dmitri asked. "I don't know. They kept coming, Dmitri. There must have been at least 7 different groups. As soon as we finished one, another group would attack. Phoenix and I fought until we were almost dead from exhaustion, and Phoenix was in bad shape, exhausted from using her powers non-stop. There was no way to replenish her strength because we had lost all our supplies. The horses, our blood, our food, all gone. From the way they attacked us, I realized they were after her and I was just in the way, so I tried to lead them away from her. We switched shirts and ran in opposite directions. Many of them followed me and I was able to defeat them, but when I went back for her, all I found was blood on the ground. Phoenix was nowhere to be found." Raphael put his head in his hands. "I am so sorry, Dmitri." Dmitri was livid and tried to hold back his rage from Raphael. Raphael wasn't at fault and had done his best to protect her, but Dmitri's rage was primal and had no logic. It rose like a storm, completely obliterating his gifts of logic and empathy, leaving nothing but a predator of immense strength, speed, and agility. He moved in toward Raphael. Ambrose and Celeste yelled to him to stop, but their words were like buzzing, annoying flies in his ears. Dmitri wanted to kill something, anything. He seized Raphael by the throat. "Dmitri," Ambrose barked. "Stop! We have to find Phoenix, and now!" Dmitri released his grip and dropped his hand. There was no time for this. There was something more important to do than kill Raphael. Dmitri turned toward the door and then back toward Ambrose, confused. Phoenix, he thought. Something about finding Phoenix. Dmitri turned suddenly and left the room in a flurry of wind. The infirmary was still and quiet in his wake, and Ambrose, Celeste, and Raphael looked at one another, realizing how close they had all been to being destroyed. Frost stood beside the bed, watching the woman closely. Frost's mother was a flurry of hands as she worked desperately to put the woman back together. Meredith stretched and braced her hands to the small of her back, relieving the ache. "The girl needs blood from one of her own to heal this, Frost. Human blood alone will not work. The blood is giving her energy, but she needs our blood to regenerate rapidly. I don't know what else to do. I have stitched her throat, but she will die without our blood." Meredith looked at the woman and brushed her hair from her face. "This should have been a mortal wound. Someone meant to kill her." She went to the sink and washed the blood from her hands. Frost understood what his mother was saying. No one would give this woman blood. When vampires shared blood, they risked being bound together for eternity, if by chance that person was their true mate. If one of the pair were to die, the other would die shortly after. And if the two were far apart for an extended period, they become weak. There were benefits to blood bonding, including increased strength, shared abilities, and faster healing, but it left the vampire race vulnerable to being wiped out during wartime. Enemies could kill 2 vampires by killing 1. Blood mating was taboo now, after hearing about the Fae, and considered far too risky for all vampires. Frost knew the risk, but wasn't willing to allow this woman to die. 1 blood-bound pair in the entire vampire population wouldn't matter, and while there would be risk to both, there wouldn't be risk to the population. Frost had found this woman and brought her here, and it was his destiny to help her. He refused to let this woman die. Frost watched Phoenix's chest rise and fall as she struggled to breathe, and made his decision. The woman needed vampire blood, and soon. "Mother, I will share my blood with her." Meredith looked at Frost, stunned. "Absolutely not, Frost. That is too dangerous. And what about Natasha?" Meredith dried her hands with the towel and looked at Phoenix, frowning. "You don't even know this woman. Are you willing to break Natasha's heart and throw your future away for some stranger you found lying on the forest floor?" Frost paced the floor. "How could I live with myself if I let this woman die? There is no certainty that we would bind, and if we do, so be it. And Natasha is my friend only. You and she may think we will marry, but I will not. What she thinks of my actions is of little consequence. I am doing this." Frost walked to the bed, pushed up his sleeve, and used his fangs to pierce open the skin. At once, blood swelled to the surface, and he put his arm to Phoenix's mouth, trying to coax her to bite him, hoping the drive for the blood would break through her unconsciousness. When she didn't bite, he opened her mouth and let the blood drip down her throat. Phoenix perked up almost at once, and her throat began moving as she swallowed. Suddenly, she sank her fangs into his arm. Frost had never been bitten by another vampire before, and wasn't prepared for the searing hot pain, and fought not to pull his arm away. In moments, the woman's eyes flew open, and she pushed the numbing agent into his arm, and the pain subsided. After a few minutes, she stopped drinking and drew her head back, resting it on the pillow. Frost looked at her neck and saw it was healing rapidly. The wound still looked like ragged flesh sewn together, but the edges of the wound were starting to bind. Thank the gods. Frost didn't know why, but he felt it was his mission to keep her here. Meredith finished cleaning the rags and basins in silence and refused to look at him. Frost knew she was angry, but he was a man, and this was his decision. When Meredith finished cleaning, she moved toward the door to leave, but then stopped suddenly. With her back to him, she said, "You better hope you don't bond to her." Meredith left the room, and Frost sat quietly next to this woman whose name he didn't even know. He looked into the shimmering blue eyes of this woman who had risen like a phoenix from her own ashes. When King Nidug received the news that Phoenix was likely dead, he readied himself to send his mind outward to find her. If he couldn't find her with his power, he knew she would be dead. King Nidug slumped in his chair, unable to muster up the energy to seek her for the moment. Unfamiliar feelings welled up in him, and he studied them. Something that was close to sadness. Nidug hadn't felt this feeling since he was very new, and he tried to push it away. Nidug didn't know why he was sad, and decided it could only be one of two options. Either he was sad because he lost his war prize, or he was sad because he had real feelings for Phoenix. Nidug didn't know how to read this feeling. He shook his head, impatient with his unusual self-reflection. Phoenix was either dead or alive, and he would find out which. Dmitri lay in bed, unable to sleep. Phoenix was alive because he could feel her, weak as the signal was, but he didn't know where she was, and he couldn't tell if she was okay. He imagined all the horrible things that could be happening to her. Phoenix could be held a hostage somewhere, tortured or raped. Dmitri shook his head to clear the images. Not knowing was eating him alive, and he wouldn't be able to concentrate on anything until he found her. He was restless and agitated, and inaction was driving him crazy. Celeste had urged him to rest tonight so that he could start his journey to the Dominions at dawn. But he didn't want to be High King right now. He wanted to go in search for her and damn the Dominions. Celeste was right, he knew. He had responsibilities to fulfill, and he would have to trust that the others would find Phoenix. Dmitri finally drifted off to sleep when he heard his name being called, as though from far away. He opened his eyes and found himself in a field of tall, dry grass, endless and gold as far as the eye could see. The sun shone brightly, the grass aflame in the sun. A breeze lifted his hair, and he heard his name again in the wind. The grasses parted like a curtain, and a woman emerged and walked toward him. Dmitri shook his head. It was the Lady of the Lake. This didn't seem right. "This is no lake," he said. "How is it that you are here?" The lady laughed, and the sound was like water tumbling over rocks. "I am the Lady of the Lake. I am not the lady in the lake. My power comes from water, so it is helpful for me to be next to the source of my power." She looked up at the sky. "But today I wanted the sun and the feeling of grass stroking my skin." Dmitri sighed and waited for her to speak, wondering what shit she was going to throw at him today. The lady looked at him with a stern expression. Dmitri forgot she could hear his thoughts. "I am here to help you, Dmitri," she said. I only came to give you some advice. Phoenix is safe, for now. I know you feel strongly for her, but she is only one of billions that depend on you now. The Dominions are in grave danger. If you get distracted from your plans to bring balance back to the Dominions by trying to find her, you may be too late, and there will be irreparable harm to your people. I can promise you that you will meet her again on this journey, but you must put your kingdom first. Phoenix has her own destiny. What do you mean? Dmitri said. What does she have to do? The Lady of the Lake smiled. Nothing much, Dmitri. Just the work of saving the kingdom. Dmitri crossed his arms over his chest. Is that supposed to be a joke? He asked. No, the lady said, her face serious. Phoenix must do the work she is fated for, and you must let her do it. Dmitri remained silent. He detested these visits from the lady, always giving him vague warnings and unsought advice, and sometimes downright confusing riddles. The lady spoke to him as if he were better than he was. I won't pretend to be something I am not, Dmitri said. I am not the good man you think I am. I am selfish, and I don't hesitate to kill when the situation calls for it. Dmitri stepped closer to her and held her gaze with his own. Heed my warning, lady. I will bring a thorough shitstorm to you and to the Fates if I don't find Phoenix. It will be so wide and deep you won't know what hit you. A wind suddenly picked up, and the lady's silver hair lifted off her back and floated around her like the ripples of a stream. The grass bent under the wind, and a cloud passed over the sun, darkening the field. The Lady of the Lake didn't move, but only nodded, not flinching from Dmitri's gaze. After a moment, the wind died down. Very well, Dmitri, she said. Consider me warned. You may go back now. Dmitri sat up with a start, soaked in sweat, as always after one of the Lady of the Lake visits. He looked out the window of his bedchamber and saw the first pale smudge of pink along the horizon. Dmitri got up and dressed. It was time to leave. The Lady of the Lake said Phoenix was safe, and he would see her again. Those words had taken the edge off his worry and quieted the rage. The lady might be confusing, but she always spoke the truth. Dmitri had work to do, and he would have to be patient. He would see Phoenix again. Dmitri dressed in black riding trousers, with black boots, and a black shirt trimmed in silver. He draped the dark blue and silver cloak of royalty over his shoulders, and finished by placing the silver crown on his head, a much lighter one than the ornate gold crown he wore in the palace. The staff had packed his belongings in the caravan, and he would pick up whatever else he needed in his travels. Dmitri was about to leave his room when Aurora walked into his room. Damn it, Aurora, he snapped. Don't you ever fucking bother to knock. Stop walking into my rooms unannounced. Aurora smiled. I have already explained why I do it, so why are you angry? Aurora touched him, her fingers lighting delicately on his bicep. Please try to get used to it for the next 3 months, Dmitri, she said sweetly. I haven't agreed to that part of the arrangement, Dmitri said. This is my private room, and I want you to knock. Perhaps I will have to start locking my door from now on. Aurora waved her hand, dismissing his complaint. Whatever, she said. I am here because we have to be seen leaving together. Apparently there was quite the commotion last night over Raphael and the late Phoenix. Aurora smirked. Do not appear grief-stricken over your lost love. We need to kill any rumors before they start. Dmitri didn't like the way Phoenix's name sounded on Aurora's tongue. Don't ever speak her name to me, he hissed. In fact, I would prefer if you never talked about her to me in the future. And by the way, Phoenix isn't dead. She is very much alive and healthy. Aurora looked surprised. Oh? How do you know that? Never mind. I just know, Dmitri said grimly. Aurora looked at him closely, trying to decide if he spoke the truth, or if this was merely hope. Very well, she said. We still have an agreement, so let's play the happy lovers, shall we? Aurora looped her arm in Dmitri's, and they left his rooms together and headed to the castle's exit. The party was already there, milling about, waiting to leave. Dmitri escorted Aurora to her caravan. He was preparing to help her up when she grabbed the back of his head, pulling him into a kiss. Dmitri allowed her to kiss him for a moment, then pulled back and moved his mouth to her ear. Everyone would assume they were whispering lovers, but the words he had for her weren't the words of a lover. Don't do that shit again, Aurora, he whispered. I detest you, and I don't want Phoenix to hear about the two of us acting as lovers. Aurora whispered her response back in his ear. The point is that the entire kingdom should hear about it. Naturally, that includes her. That is, if she really is alive. Aurora pulled back and placed her hands on both sides of his face, holding him close, and looked into his eyes. There will be plenty to hear about in the next 3 months, my dear. You should resign yourself to that. Aurora dropped her hands and pulled away from Dmitri. Her heart was beating so fast she thought she might faint. Feeling his lips on hers again was more than she could handle. Feeling his body against hers made her body respond with a primal hunger. Aurora thought about Phoenix. She had it on good authority the bitch was indeed dead. A lichen had separated her head from her body. Aurora would bide her time. Dmitri would stop denying Phoenix's death, and he would see things her way. He would come to her on his own when he'd finished grieving his loss. Frost, you son of a bitch! Where are you? Shit, thought Frost. Natasha must have heard what happened. Natasha came through the door, her steps so loud they should have awakened the entire house. Frost looked at the woman, still sleeping peacefully. Natasha, he whispered. Be quiet. She is still resting. Natasha stood in front of Frost, her hands balled into fists. I don't give a good damn fuck what she's doing, she hissed. How could you let her bite you? Natasha smacked Frost on the shoulder. What if you are bound to her? What does that mean for us? Frost was sick of having this conversation. Damn it, Natasha. Stop listening to my mother and listen to me. There is no us. There never will be an us. I love you as a sister. How can I change that love into something else? Natasha crossed her arms. You're just confused because we grew up together. But if you end up bound to her, we will never know what could have been between us, she said. First, I don't feel bound to this woman, Frost said. I am sad that she was dying alone in the forest, and that my own clan was going to let her die. Isn't caring for others what matters? Shouldn't we be celebrating that we were able to help someone? Instead, all anyone can talk about is the possibility of blood binding. I, for one, am very happy you helped, a voice said. See? At least someone here has compassion. Frost stopped when he saw it was the woman who had spoken. She struggled to sit up. She grimaced in pain and fell back on the bed. Frost rushed to her side. Oh my gods, you're awake! How are you feeling? Phoenix felt terrible. Her mouth was dry as sand. Worse, claws were raking down her throat when she tried to speak. She looked at the young man, and he seemed so eager and happy to see her awake. Not too bad, she lied. Her voice came out like a croak. Frost shot off questions he had been wondering over the last week as he watched her go in and out of consciousness. Do you know your name, or where you come from? Do you know who tried to kill you? Phoenix motioned that she needed water, and the boy brought a cup over and helped her drink. She swished the water in her mouth and swallowed gingerly. My name is Phoenix Gray, she said. I'm from... She grew silent, reaching in her mind for the answer, but nothing came. Phoenix grew alarmed and tried to sit up again, but the pain from lifting her head from the pillow discouraged her. Oh my gods, she said. Phoenix wondered if she was supposed to know this boy. Where did I come from? Do you know me? Frost shook his head. No, I never saw you until I found you in the forest. He turned to Natasha. Go get my father and mother, and tell them our guest is awake. Natasha pursed her lips. Fine, Frost, but we aren't done talking. Not by a long shot. She gave Phoenix a hard look and walked out of the room. Frost picked up Phoenix's hand and held it in his. I am Faustino, he cried, but everyone calls me Frost. It is nice to meet you, Phoenix. A tall man with dark brown hair entered the room, followed by a boy, the spitting image of Frost. The older man walked to Phoenix's bed and looked at her carefully, measuring her. Finally, he nodded. Hello, Phoenix Gray. I'm Edward, the clan leader. He pulled up a chair and sat next to her bed. Is it okay if I call you Phoenix? Phoenix nodded. Edward smiled at her. Frost found you in the forest. A witch and a lichen had attacked you and left you for dead. Do you know why someone would want to kill you? Phoenix shook her head. I don't know. I can't remember anything." She bit her lower lip in concentration, trying to catch a fragment of a memory, but there was nothing there. "I can't even remember what I was doing there, or where I come from." Phoenix looked up at Edward. Edward saw the confusion in her eyes and believed she was telling him the truth. She wasn't hiding anything. "I see," he said. "Perhaps in time your memory will return, but whether it does or doesn't, when you are feeling well enough, I want you to be on your way. You cannot stay here with us." Frost put his hand on his father's shoulder. "Don't send her away, Father. As long as her memory is gone, she will be vulnerable out there. You would be sending her to her death. Giving her my blood would have been for nothing." The older man looked at Frost, his face stony. "What you did was stupid, Frost, and I don't have time to explain how stupid. I have to think of every man, woman, and child here. You could have brought a killer into our clan. We have enough to deal with just holding back the Rouge vampires. Now this. You have added one more burden for me." Frost looked at his feet, remorseful. He had meant to help. He didn't mean to add more troubles for his father or for his clan. "I'm sorry, Father," he said. Edward shook his head. "Regardless, making her leave may be a moot point. If she ends up being bound to you, we will have to keep her here. We will watch and see what happens." Phoenix listened to the conversation and felt a memory slither, snake-like, just out of reach at the mention of Rouge vampires. She interrupted Edward. "Excuse me, what are these Rouge vampires you mentioned?" Frost shook his head and patted her arm. "Nothing a pretty girl like you needs to be concerned with. As long as you are here, we will protect you." Phoenix pulled her arm back and bristled at his words. The words were condescending and not the way to address her. Phoenix didn't know how she knew, nor what the proper form of address would be. Memories were hovering just out of reach, and when she tried to grasp them, they slipped away. Frost and Edward continued talking, and she tried to listen to what they were saying, but her eyes were heavy. She tried to stay awake, but couldn't hang on. Her eyes closed, and she sank into oblivion. When Frost saw that Phoenix was asleep, he motioned to his father and brother to leave. Frost knew Edward wasn't finished with him, and he didn't want their argument to disturb her. Phoenix needed rest. Maybe with sleep her memory would return. That would be her best hope, he thought. Otherwise, he didn't know what would happen to her. Dimitri's party had stopped in a meadow for the midday break. The sun hung high above the trees, and the air was thick with the moist scent of decaying leaves. The party was scattered about, some practicing their sword skills, others leaning against trees, eyes closed, trying to rest before they started back on their journey. Dimitri had chased Aurora away earlier. He told her he needed time to himself, and she had complied, although she sulked as she did so. Dimitri sat on a rock, apart from the group, and sipped hot tea to soothe his throat, but it was little help. His throat was raw and on fire, but it wasn't his pain. It belonged to Phoenix, and no amount of hot tea was going to alleviate it. Dmitri didn't know how he could feel her in this way. It was as though he were in her body. He felt everything she felt. There had been this intense connection with Phoenix since they had made love. Where did it come from? Dmitri remembered the night they had spent together and recalled that in the heat of passion he had bitten her. He wondered if he had set in motion a blood bond between them. Such a thing was taboo because of the possibility of war looming on the horizon. Yet Dmitri felt a flush of pleasure at the thought. Bloodbound, she would have no choice but to be his. No matter how angry she was now, Phoenix had to return to him. She'd be compelled to do so. With the two of them bound, they would be stronger, their gifts shared and mixed. Together they would be nearly undefeatable. Dmitri felt her across the distance and knew that even though she was hurt, she was alive. Phoenix was strong, and she could protect herself. He smiled at the thought of her. Dmitri looked up and saw curious faces watching him. He was sure they thought he was smiling about Aurora. Good. Let them think so. He drained the rest of his tea and hung the cup from his pack. "Let's move!" he yelled. Dmitri mounted his horse and watched as his party rushed to collect their things and get on their horses. The guards mounted and surrounded him as they rode off to the Third Dominion. This concludes another episode of the Book Speaks podcast, where the book speaks for itself. Thanks for joining me, your host, Benjamin Douglas, for another indie author reading. If you liked what you heard, be sure to visit http://thebookspeakspodcast.wordpress.com for more episodes and for links to the author's website and the author's Amazon author page in the show notes. If you'd like to follow me on my own author journey, you can find me at http://benjamindouglasbooks.wordpress.com. And of course, if you're an indie author interested in having your work featured on the show, or if you're interested in discussing having your book read and produced by me as an audiobook, feel free to contact me at benjamindouglasbooks@gmail.com. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you have a productive and enjoyable weekend.